So now we are moving to another very interesting panel, the course of transatlantic relations and the E.U.-U.S. Trade and Technology Council process. A discussion over the course of the transatlantic relation has always been part of the program of the Greek Economics Summit the last decade, if I remember well. And this is because this relationship constantly go through various stages, sometimes of love, sometimes of rivalry. However, despite the ups and downs, trade and investment between the two continents account almost half of the global one. So the latest geopolitical and economic global developments, though, are setting another element into the question, that of the common values we are sharing and which distinguish this relation. The two sides, after a failed try, and I guess we all remember the TTIP course and process, are trying again to set the framework for a stable and sustainable trade and economic relations through the formation of the Trade and Technology Council. TTC is intended to address complex issues that affect economies and regulatory regimes on both sides of the Atlantic. Despite the challenges, the TTC presents the best opportunity to show that the United States and European Union can take concrete steps forward towards real cooperation. To discuss the course of the transatlantic relations and the TTC, we have a very excellent panel here with us, and I want to welcome sorry. Okay. It's like I'm on TV. Anyway, so as I said, for this conversation with us is Susan Dunger, CEO of AmchamEU, Garrett Workman, European Affairs, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Francis Burwell, Distinguished Fellow, Europe Center Atlantic Council and Senior Director, McLarty Associates, and Mr. George Pagoulatos, Director General, ELIAMEP, Professor of European Politics and Economy, Athens University of Economic and Business. So I don't know whether the Susan, Garrett, and Francis are virtually connected with us. Are they?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Elias.
Hello, control. Okay, put them on, and that's all right. Okay, let's. Hi, Susan. How are you? From Athens,
Elias,
Greece.
Nice to see you, Elias.
You've been part of the transatlantic panel the last 3 years, if I remember well, right?
It's great to be back. It's in my calendar now every year, Elias, as long as I'm invited. Good to be back, also with the fellow panelists as well, with Fran.
I guess Francis is with us as well, and we're waiting for... oh, you're here, right? And we're waiting for Garrett, and of course, George Pagoulatos is with us as well. So I will start the questions with you, Susan. Considering the geopolitical developments and the energy and inflation crisis, do you think the transatlantic relations are the level they should be? And if not, why?
Yeah, thanks, Elias. Well, that's a big question. Well, maybe just let me say, a bit of background here. We all know the last few years we've had challenges, supply chains, the war in Ukraine, energy, food, inflation, all those that encompass these geopolitical developments that you say. But for the transatlantic partners, probably these global threats have actually brought us closer together. So that's a feeling. We've been through some troubled times, but including over the last 2 years, on the whole, we've come closer together, and these threats do continue to bring us closer. I believe that it's the challenges themselves have made us even more united. If you take, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, the two partners swiftly got together, created the vaccines task force, leading the world towards recovery, the war in Ukraine, joint sanctions against Russia, condemning violence against international law. And then if you look at climate, We revived the Paris Agreement, and we've created other forums such as the High-Level Climate Action Group, the Green Tech Alliance, and so forth. Also on trade, which is the topic today that I know we're going to get into more, of course, there's been the formation of the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, which we'll come on to. So the tone has also improved. Moving on a little bit to answer your question, Elias, yes, I think we're in a good place. However, the last week, few days have been a little bit shaky with the reaction that we've seen towards the Inflation Reduction Act, which in itself, this landmark piece of federal law that's come out with the top priority of addressing climate change and clean energy, has great ambition, and is really, we should be aligned on what it's trying to achieve. But there is still a lot that needs to be ironed out. And I don't know how in Greece, Elias, but certainly you've seen the concerns that have been raised on the EU side, whether it's from the Commission itself, whether it's from member state governments, concerns about discrimination against the EU, concerns about encouraging investment from the EU into the US. So there is now a danger of a trade war, and we sincerely want to avoid this at all counts. We have to avoid escalation. So I would say now, moving forward, in terms of answering the question about where we stand now, I think it's still positive. We've got the Trade and Technology Council actually meeting today as we speak, in fact. I think the principals are meeting. We have a stakeholder session later, which I'm proud to say I'll be representing AmChamEU and talking as part of that stakeholder session. It's the third ministerial. We're very supportive of that. So I think we have to put the Inflation Reduction Act aside, treat that separately. That should not be actually discussed as part of the TTC. The Privacy Shield doesn't need to be discussed as part of the TTC. The TTC is a forward-looking forum. We need to treat it that way, not as a sort of one-off agreement. And overall, I think we have so much in common. We may have different approaches, but we need to look at what we've got in common, look at the good things, and treat this as an absolute imperative that we do need to work together. We do need EU-US leadership at the moment, and we need cooperation. So I would say with absolute certainty, Elias, we've had some difficulties in challenging times, but to the title of your confidence, we can bet big now on our alliances, and I'm feeling positive about it.
Well, I wouldn't expect any better closing from you, Susan, regarding this question. I'm moving to the Francis. Francis, good to have you with us. What are your views about the outcome of the midterm elections? Would they possibly affect the policies of the US government, especially on those related to trade and transatlantic relations?
So thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I only wish I could be in Greece in person rather than sitting here in a very cold Maryland morning. Let me first make one comment about my good friend Susan's comments. I think we need to be very cautious about words like trade war. We have always had trade disputes. We will continue to have disputes. And it's a matter of how much we can put them into boxes, as in this task force that is addressing the IRA, and keep them contained. I am hopeful that the TTC today that their final statement will reiterate what President Biden said, which was that it was not intentional, and that they understand the concerns of the Europeans and that a solution will be found. On the midterm elections, however, I think that is going to present quite a challenge for many of our friends and partners. I want to distinguish between concrete policy impact and rhetorical impact. I don't think it's going to have a huge concrete policy impact, except in a few areas which I'll come to very quickly. The president is mostly in charge of foreign policy. And the Senate will continue, which is in Democratic hands, will continue to approve ambassadors and judges. But we will see much more divisive language within particularly the House of Representatives. We would see this anyway because we're only a year away from the presidential race opening with the primaries. So we would see it anyhow. But because there is so much conflict within the Republican Party, that's going to ramp up the rhetoric a whole lot. It's going to be very confusing for those of us for those outside the United States and for us inside the United States trying to figure out what policy will be. And my advice would be to pay attention to who is saying what you're hearing, whether it is politically motivated or whether it is being said by someone who actually has the authority to make a change based on what they're saying. In terms of concrete issues that will be affected, I would point to 4 issues. First, there'll be no major legislative packages, for good or bad, except for those required to keep the US government open. There will be no trade promotion authority, for example. We were not expecting the Biden administration to ask for that, and the TTC can move forward with the types of things that it's doing without trade promotion authority. So that's not such a big deal. Ukraine is a much bigger deal. And here we're going to hear a lot of rhetoric that casts doubt on the US commitment to Ukraine. I don't think it will actually affect the amount of weapons and the amount of funding that the Ukrainians will receive from the US, but the rhetoric will make us look a lot more divided, and in my view is in that way will give Putin hope that he can continue, that he can divide the West, which he has so far failed to do. Another area is the digital services tax deal at the OECD. We have kind of sort of passed Pillar 2. It's a bit different from what the OECD one is, but the United States could be given a pass. But we've not passed Pillar 1. And I don't see any hope for that. And I think it's going to be problematic in terms of those European countries who have had digital services taxes and who may lose patience with the failure of the United States to pass the OECD deal. And finally, there is a risk of legislative initiatives that at the last moment have a strong Buy America element to them. This is balanced by the fact that it will be so hard to get packages through that we probably won't see very many of them, but there will be many more, shall we say, independent actions on Capitol Hill that are not based on what the administration wants or a coherent policy towards our European allies, but rather on 1 or 2 people managing to get something into a bill that is very harmful. So I think it's just a matter of some turbulent time coming up, but most of it's going to be rhetorical, not concrete.
Well, thank you, Francis. Garrett, welcome, by the way. It's good to have you here. What are the main goals of the TTC? Are you optimistic with the round talk so far? Where we stand now, and what should we expect in today's, by the way, session? If you have any information to share with us, that would be nice.
Thanks a lot, Elias, and I apologize for being late. It's a complicated morning in the Washington, D.C. area, including for us trying to support a few events happening across town. So I apologize for that. Indeed, expectations are fairly measured, I would say, for today's meeting, although we also are eager to see progress because obviously we're eager to see the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council start showing results. And I think, the fact that we've had this is now the 3rd meeting, it's time to start delivering on commercially significant priorities. Obviously, today's meeting, as Fran just laid out, is happening against a difficult backdrop in light of the challenges created by recent U.S. legislation and as well, frankly, by complicated processes in Europe, whether it's the digital agenda, which largely seems to be targeting successful large US tech companies, or potential challenges from things like the forthcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we really need to show a more united front between the US and Europe on all of these issues. We have a lot more in common than we have that divides us. And as is typical in the transatlantic relationship, we spend 95% of our time talking about the 5% of things where we disagree. And that's really unfortunate. And I'm hopeful that today, our colleagues are right now participating in the trade and labor dialogue on an important discussion focusing on how to counter forced labor in global supply chains. And this is a really important issue for the US and EU to get right together. Certainly a large focus on China, but not exclusively. Similarly, we're eager to see progress on standards for emerging technology. Obviously, we have a lot of focus on artificial intelligence, eager to see how that's going to play into the EU's proposed AI Act. And then also, there's new programs that are going to be announced on telecommunications infrastructure in third countries. And I think this is another area of opportunity for the US and Europe working together in other markets to counter the what we've seen from China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, and showing that market economies can deliver, can offer alternative suppliers that are trusted and aren't siphoning data away and sending it to untrustworthy governments. But it's really important that we start showing that this thing can deliver, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of credibility in the eyes of the world. We have a really important and strategic alignment that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created for us. And I think that the NATO alliance is probably stronger today than it's ever been. A year ago, no one would have thought, Sweden and Finland would be joining NATO, for example. Obviously, we still need to get that finalized, but the entire world has changed, and it would be really unfortunate if we don't meet this moment with some commercially significant economic connectivity between us as well. And then last but not least, I think it's really important to think about supply chain connectivity. We have, on both sides of the Atlantic, a focus on semiconductors in particular, but also critical minerals. If we're going to meet the goals of our energy transition, we need something like 500% more lithium than we have today. A lot of that is being mined in China, but that's not the only place lithium exists. We actually need to do a better job of permitting, mining, and getting access to these minerals in the US, in Europe, and in like-minded countries like Canada and Australia. And for the TTC to start showing that it can deliver those kinds of results is really important. So we're looking forward to seeing what happens across town today. And then, of course, this is just one meeting, and it's frankly important that we not limit ourselves to progress only in the every 6 months or so that the principals are meeting. And so another key aspect for the chamber and for our partners, the AmChams and elsewhere, is that they do a better job of engaging with stakeholders throughout this process. And we not just have an opportunity to talk to the principals after the communique has been signed, but that we have an opportunity to engage with each working group throughout the process. And so we'll see how things go, and then we'll take it from there and double down on this progress.
Well, thank you, Garrett. Very moderate response here regarding the TTC. George, there are concerns raised in EU states regarding the recent Inflation Reduction Act, thinking that this package is somehow subsidizing US companies and threaten to hurt European industry. Do you agree with that this might be harmful, to the transatlantic relations, to this act, and to what degree?
Thank you, Elias. We are indeed, and I agree with the previous speakers, at one of the finest moments of transatlantic unity between Europe and the US, and much of it is certainly credited not just to the determination of the European Union leaders, but also to the leadership provided by President Biden, who is one of the most Atlanticist presidents that the US has had in recent decades. And it is quite admirable that the European Union has reacted very decisively to Russia's aggression by putting forward a set of sanctions. It is also true that the cost of these sanctions falls disproportionately upon Europe. Recently, President Biden mentioned the 300 billion windfall profits made by US energy companies as a result of the war. Much of it is competitiveness sucked out of Europe. On top of that, a lot of the military equipment that is provided to Europe comes from the United States. Thus, the impact on European defense industry is not what it would be if there would be a greater role in terms of EU industry. And on top of this, the Inflation Reduction Act that you mentioned, which is a landmark achievement of the Biden presidency, a very important effort to accelerate adjustment to the climate goals and to tackle Chinese protectionism and to support green transition in the US. But it is a problem that there are barriers when it comes to European companies participating in that project. They need to be settled in the US, which means that they will need to disinvest from Europe. And this is viewed as a challenge, to put it mildly, on the part of the European Union. European Union also applies green subsidies, industrial subsidies, but it does not discriminate against non-EU firms. US-based Tesla can be a beneficiary, for example, of European green subsidies. Hence, there is great concern, and this has been the topic of not just today's Council, but the bilateral meeting between President Biden and President Macron. There's concern of how the European Union can react. Yesterday, President von der Leyen mentioned that the state aid rules will have to be streamlined. There's discussion about a fiscal package on the table. Many are talking about a Buy European to counterbalance President Biden's Buy American. With an ongoing hot war in Ukraine and in a kind of evolving Cold War with China, the last thing that we need is a trade war between the two closest allies, Europe and the U.S. So I'm hopeful that there will be adjustments to the package, but as it stands, it is quite clear that it comes at the expense of Europe's industrial competitiveness, and it would eventually force the European Union to adopt measures to support European industry and to support it in the project of green transition more specifically.
Thank you. By the way, yesterday was exactly this conversation between President Biden and President Macron. Actually, President Biden promised the French president that he will again, check this, package and include probably European companies. Susan, coming back to you, to what degree you think the transatlantic relations on trade and investments will be impacted by a possible TTC agreement? Could such agreement become a global reference for trade and investments?
Yes, thanks, Elias. I mean, I think some of this has been covered by the previous speakers. I think maybe I want to start off by stressing what the TTC is again, and Garrett mentioned this. Remember, it's a forum. It's not a trade agreement. It is not designed to be a trade agreement. So maybe just to clarify the audience that, we're not expecting some big agreement to be announced today. There are 10 working groups as part of this Trade and Technology Council, and these are going to be living organisms that continue. I totally agree with the other speakers that, the business community does want to see progress made. But I think we have to be a bit realistic as well. So firstly, it's about building relationships between the two. We may think again, well, the EU and the US, we do indeed. We have so much in common. It's been said already. We have, I think it was 95% of the time, Garrett just said, is unfortunately spent on what we disagree on. Remember about everything that we agree on. So let's just draw back to answer your question. There are these 10 working groups. So this is the tool to be focused and targeted on making progress in different areas. I think what's been mentioned so far, semiconductors has been mentioned, artificial intelligence, I believe, has been mentioned, raw materials has been mentioned as an absolutely crucial area of focus. So let's use it for that. I would say, to answer your question, Elias, will the relationship be impacted by an agreement? The relationship, of course, if today there is a positive statement at the end, which we very much hope so, that we do see some deliverables. My understanding is that there may be a potential focus on 3 in particular. We're looking at perhaps a deliverable on AI, something on supply chains, and maybe a statement about democratic values. Then I would say that would be an extremely positive development. I think a positive development would also be that the discussions about the Inflation Reduction Act do not consume what is happening on the TTC. Let's focus on the TTC. As I said earlier, the TTC is not the place to discuss the Inflation Reduction Act. That should be done in the margins, as well as the data privacy framework. Let's focus on some of these actual specifics. So could it be a model going forward? I believe it's already been floated as one. It is a living forum, so it could potentially, if this works, be a global model for whether it's multilateral discussions or whether it's a model for the EU with India or with other blocs. I would say absolutely. I would say let's focus now on working together to tackle. Let's use it to tackle the new and emerging issues that are emerging from this transformation of our economies, and let's use it. The EU and the US can actually use it then to inspire others. Let's use it to show that understanding can be created, and also constructive dialogue can be created. So, and finally, totally agree. Let's not limit ourselves to these ministerials. Let's not just assume, oh my gosh, if something's not announced today, this is a failure. Absolutely not. We need to engage throughout the process, and that goes for all of us. And indeed, agree with Garrett. We are looking for, stakeholder involvement in between the ministerials. So yes, I believe it could be a model, and yes, we have to all see it as all go for it and make sure that there is a positive outcome to the TTC.
Thank you, Suzanne. Francis, how do you think TTC will, the framework exactly is not an agreement, will feed into global efforts to promote a democratic model of digital governance? Is that possible?
Yes, it is possible. I should say that I'm a big fan of the TTC remaining a bilateral forum. I think as you started out this whole session, by indicating the strength and the unique strength of the U.S.-EU economic relationship, one that is based not only on extensive trade, but also on mutual investment. And so I think that this is a way forward for the United States and the EU to tackle some significant issues and to create the building blocks for cooperation in a whole lot of regulatory areas in the future. But we do have to recognize that the US and the EU are not alone in this world, and there are some significant like-minded countries out there, particularly in this world of geopolitics. It is increasingly important that we have strong ties with others who support our values and who want to see, for example, the internet look the way we want to see the internet look like in the future, not the way that China or Russia might want to see what the internet looks like. We need to help develop a consensus among ourselves, the US and the EU, but we also need to take that consensus and extend it farther out among countries such as, well, there's some who just come on board anyway, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan. One of the lessons of the Ukraine experience has been how much these countries have come forward to participate in sanctions and export controls. Particularly for a country like Japan, this is unprecedented, and I think that we should applaud it very much. But we also need to win over the fence sitters, those who are being more neutral in the way that they are approaching the world, and to make clear to them the benefits of joining our like-minded coalition, if you will. I wanted to kind of say how the TTC relates to this in two areas. First is AI, artificial intelligence. We have the European AI Act that's been proposed and is under discussion. And we have the US Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which has much of the same language. The TTC is expected to announce a roadmap on AI today that will serve as a foundation for cooperation in international standard setting bodies. So we will have a way to move forward, or a consensus on AI of how to move forward and to engage with other countries in what we think is the right way to use AI and not the right way to use AI. But also point to the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. This was something that grew out of the US Democracy Summit, but the EU jumped on board and had quite a large role in writing the final declaration. It is a set of principles intended to kind of set out what countries need to do to help keep the internet free and democratic. And initially, there were 60 countries, including, I believe, all EU member states, or almost all EU member states, as well as the Commission, on board. We need to expand that group while also figuring out benchmarks for how you keep data free flow with trust, for example, which is one of the principles. How do countries that sign up, how can they be benchmarked to say that they are adhering to this? And how can we then give indications to those who we want to bring on board of what they need to do to help us keep the internet democratic in the future? This discussion has become an increasingly central discussion in the TTC. And we are seeing, when it comes to platform governance and data governance in the TTC, we're seeing less success on what I would call the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Data Act set of issues. But we're seeing more interest in content moderation. We're seeing more interest in human rights. And as was pointed out, the forced labor discussion also today. We expect that the TTC will announce a Protecting Human Rights Defenders declaration today. And this is all how we move this forward into a global democratic.
I need to stop you here, if I may, because I need to ask another question here. We don't have too much time, and I'm going to the next question very fast to George. Is still China the elephant in the room? George, can that enforce a solid transatlantic alliance? Because what I'm hearing, somehow China is the elephant in the room, right?
Well, on China, Europe and the U.S. are in the same sync. Let's recall the first meeting of Secretary Blinken with the Chinese leadership right after President Biden had taken over. He used exactly the same framing that the European Union uses. So China is viewed as an economic competitor, as a partner when it comes to global public goods such as climate, and as a systemic rival. And this is a shared framework. Now, it is also understood that China presents a security challenge, and this is understanding both the U.S. and the EU. Perhaps there are differences of degree. There are differences of degree in terms of how fast and how far Europe should go with when it comes to decoupling from China. There's a clear understanding that Europe needs to decouple when it comes to artificial intelligence or 5G, security-relevant technology, and there is a clear tendency towards what we call friendshoring when it comes to supply chains on raw materials and critical supplies, away from China towards more friendly countries. And on that, the two poles are in sync. But again, this is an issue also where there are differences in terms of how far and how intensely one should go. But there are also differences within the European Union as well. You would not hear exactly the same things if you are in Berlin or if you are in Vilnius inside the European Union. And there is a broad sentiment in the European Union that Europe should avoid and the West should avoid a new Cold War with China. Europe generally has a DNA towards free trading and a tendency towards supporting a rules-based multilateral order, which needs to include China. So it is a constant back and forth. It's an ongoing discussion between Europe and the U.S. But more broadly, I would say that China is more a unifier rather than divider when it comes to transatlantic relations.
Thank you, George. And last question to Garrett. Given our experiences from the COVID period regarding the supply chain and all the problems that we faced at that time, we don't observe any significant industrial productivity growth in both Europe and US despite the incentives provided. Why?
Thanks, Elias. I think it's actually really important to underline how resilient our supply chains in the health sector in particular actually were. We had a lot of artificial restrictions on vaccine exports and mask exports on certain, even within the EU. But having globally connected, resilient supply chains was actually a position of strength. You don't want to have all of your suppliers in one single country, as we saw with, for example, formula or other things throughout the last few years, where if you have a single bottleneck, that's actually a problem. So I think we need to focus on resilience rather than security. We need supply chains that are diverse and globally interconnected. I would agree with the last speaker that we're moving away from relying on China as a supplier or part of a supply chain. Companies are working in China for the Chinese market more and more, rather than as an integral part of their supply chain. But I think the other part of it is we haven't really seen those incentives. We've talked about friendshoring, but we haven't seen any tangible policy action to incentivize it. We don't want to get into a subsidy race. So I think what we should focus on instead is a more harmonized or at least more coherent regulatory approach to all of these issues. It's where the TTC should focus on semiconductors, for example. So we're not throwing money at the same problems, but we're actually investing in cutting edge technologies that maybe the market isn't ready to support yet. And similarly, if we have common approaches on supply chain due diligence, on forced labor, as I mentioned earlier, or on emerging technologies. If you have a more integrated regulatory framework across the Atlantic, it makes it easier for companies to double down on those investments and continue to do better business on both sides of the Atlantic, not necessarily to the detriment of our investments in other parts of the world, but it would definitely encourage more economic cooperation and competitiveness between us, which is, I think, a goal we should all want to strive for.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Okay, and now, well, we need to conclude here this session because time has, we exceeded the time. Thank you all for being with us again in one panel discussion of the Greek Economic Summit regarding to the transatlantic relations. And we really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you live next time in Greece, in Athens next year, okay? So have a good time. Thank you very much and see you soon. Bye-bye. Ευχαριστούμε. Προχωράμε στην επόμενη ενότητα.